media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is a Tuesday edition of Point of View. We're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about the border and Border Patrol in just a minute. I might just also mention, especially for those of you that are baseball fans, the All-Star game, but there's something involved with that, because those of you in Georgia certainly remember when you had a All-Star game that was supposed to be actually held in Atlanta. And then in 2021, Georgia passed the Election Integrity Act, and because that was seen as such an affront, they decided to move the All-Star game from Atlanta to another venue. And so as a result, you might see this as maybe a makeup call, but I think it gets us into the issue of cancel culture, which, by the way, is another one of the issues we're going to be talking about today. Later on, we'll talk about a judge that is convinced that he can override, and she can override, depending on which judge you're looking at, anything that Congress does, anything the president does. And so we'll get into some of those conversations as well. So we have a lot to cover today. But first of all, I do want to focus on the Border Patrol. And of course, just the other day, you heard us talking about the attack against ICE. Various law enforcement at that time were facing an increase in assaults of 500%. Now it's up to 700%. And there are some very significant issues associated with that. So we thought it would be good for you to hear from an individual, and we've posted this as his first article, Ammon Blair, who is a senior fellow for the Texas Public Policy Foundation Secure and Sovereign Texas Initiative. He brings a lot to the table. First of all, 10 years of experience as a U.S. Border Patrol agent, serving there in the Rio Grande Valley sector, which is really one of the busiest areas of all. Before that, served as an Army veteran. So we're going to be talking about this idea of the National Guard, Border Patrol, ICE, and a number of other issues. So, Ammon, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, sir, for having me.
Let's, if I can, maybe talk about your experience for just a minute on the border, because one of the articles we've posted is something you wrote in late May about whether or not the National Guard could be called up and should be called up, and whether or not that's unprecedented. But I thought for just a minute, let's again just talk about your own experience, because you've been to the border, you've served there at the border, and you know how porous it was and how important it was to bring support, didn't you?
Yeah, 100%. So I came off of active duty. I was stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia in 2013, and became a Border Patrol agent down in the Rio Grande Valley, so South Texas, for those that don't know what the Rio Grande Valley is. And so I served in the Rio Grande City Border Patrol Station. At the same time, I transferred to the Texas National Guard. So while I was there at the southern border, I noticed that the Mexican cartels were oddly familiar to me in that they were foreign terrorist organizations, and they were operating as such. However, we weren't really addressing that like we should. And at that time period, it was under the Obama administration. And then fast forward, I still stayed in the Texas National Guard, and I was a Border Patrol agent, and then I became an officer, an infantry officer in the Texas National Guard, and then soon jumped on the States mission as well. So I served on Operation Lone Star there in the border in the McAllen area, and I served there as an officer under Operation Lone Star as well. So I have quite a bit of experience on there, and moonlighting at the same time. I was doing intel work for private intel firms that were conducting intelligence on the CCP, the Mexican cartels, and any threats emanating from the border.
Yeah, I might just mention for people not familiar, Operation Lone Star was kind of a joint military and law enforcement operation. And I think it brings us to one of the articles we've posted that you wrote a while back, and that has to do with the fact that when the Department of Homeland Security requested 20,000 National Guard troops to help secure the southern border, the media said it was unprecedented. And so if you can, give us a little bit of a history lesson, because that is not unprecedented. As a matter of fact, you would hope that individuals would make those comments, might at least click on, I don't know, Wikipedia or something, just to fact check themselves. But give us some history if you could.
Sure. Yeah. Wikipedia is a great source. Google any search engine, because and when you look at it, when you look at the history, it was actually the War Department that was in charge of our border. There wasn't a Border Patrol until 1924.
Right.
And so the War Department and the Army specifically was charged. They had 20,000 service members along the entire border, and that still was not enough. Mexico had gone through a revolution. Pancho Villa was coming across and attacking and raiding our towns. And so in 1916, President Woodrow Wilson, he activated over 100,000 National Guard soldiers from across the U.S. To secure the border and to take out Pancho Villa's raids and wipe out the insurgency that was impacting our cities and towns. And so that actually was a precursor to World War I, and they were able to do that. And so our last time really that the military did much on the border was about 1919, and that is when Pancho Villa also tried again south of El Paso, and we actually made an incursion into Mexico, and we invaded Pancho Villa's men, and from that time forth, we never actually had a problem. But to understand the situation of what the military can and cannot do on our soil is vitally important, especially what we're seeing now in California. And soon we'll probably start seeing a nationwide where our law enforcement, they're conducting immigration enforcement. They're being attacked. Nothing is happening. We're not countering them using lawfare. And so we're going to end up having to have our own military and National Guard protecting our law enforcement so that they can actually do their job. And that's what we saw. They were actually attacking the Humvees of the National Guard that were protecting the ICE in L.A.
And again, you recognize that many of the people crossing the border just want a better life. But as your article goes into some detail, and you can speak to it, especially after we come back from the break, to how the cartels, sometimes foreign governments, maybe even actual terrorists themselves want to use and have used our open border. And so I do want to, as we go to a break, give some of you that are listening, if you've always had a question about the border, I do want to open up the phones a little bit early, 800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212, because sometimes you will ask me a question and my answer is usually, well, I've been to the border, but I haven't defended the border. Here is an individual that has worked both in the issue of Border Patrol as a Border Patrol agent, as well as an infantry platoon leader with Operation Lone Star, and so in some respects brings a lot to the table. When we come back, though, I want to maybe work our way, if we could, Ammon, through a couple of the various executive orders and the memoranda that Donald Trump has issued, because as we will be talking about later with another guest, Daniel Greenfield, you have some of these judges that have been trying to overturn either what the executive order of the president has been, or in some cases, even congressional action. So we will, of course, talk about that later, but I do want to at least talk about the justification for some of that. So we'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Ray Dalio is a billionaire hedge fund manager and founder of Bridgewater Associates. He was in Washington, D.C. to meet with senior leaders on the Republican side and the Democratic side about the budget deficit. He explained that virtually everyone agrees that you have to get the budget deficit down to 3% of GDP. He then asked them a logical question. Why can't you make a pledge that you will get it down to 3%? They explained the absolutist policies that must exist. You must make statements like, I will absolutely pledge not to raise your taxes, or I will absolutely pledge not to reduce your benefits. He concluded that this is the equivalent of an absolute pledge not to change the trajectory we're on in order to have a better set of circumstances than the likely financial crash that we're going to have. He lamented that they all agree about the consequences of this debt problem, and they all agree they cannot speak up because their constituents would throw them out of office. And their political parties will exert enough pressure on them that it is impossible to make those compromising statements and actions that bring together the revenue and expenses to produce a good budget. As I mentioned in a previous commentary, Lynn Alden, author of Broken Money, often uses the phrase, nothing stops this train, to illustrate the unstoppable momentum of fiscal deficits. She borrowed the phrase from a line in the program Breaking Bad. We have $37 trillion in national debt and nearly $2 trillion deficits each year. Members of Congress don't seem willing to stop the debt train. Ray Dalio's conversation with the political leadership illustrate they can't stop the debt train. That's why I've concluded nothing stops this train. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're privileged to have with us for a little bit longer Ammon Blair. He's the senior fellow at Texas Public Policy Foundation, great organization, which I highly recommend, and points out in this article that we've posted over the past 4 years, nearly 10 million illegal immigrants from over 170 countries have poured across our borders. We recognize that a majority of them certainly want to come here for a better life, but in the midst of those, you also have foot soldiers for the cartels, Tren de Aragua enforcers, Chinese Communist Party operatives, even foreign nationals from various countries which have been designated as terrorist havens. And so you have to pay attention to those individuals as well, and they certainly are what is the reason for so many of the actions by President Trump. So if you can, share with us a little bit, because in your article you do talk about the fact that we have these various memoranda that have been created by the president so that we can secure the border and no other individuals who intend us harm will be crossing into it. Can you give us some of that background?
Yes, sir. So back in the late 80s and early 90s, the Mexican cartels started becoming an insurgency. That's when their one-party rule in Mexico started to decrease at the local level. And so as they started to rise, what we see as the cartels today, as they started to rise in the 90s, they started establishing a pipeline into every one of our communities here in the United States. Imagine, if you will, it's like their own version of the Belt and Road Initiative that China does. Mm-hmm. So they established that Belt and Road Initiative, that Silk Road, into each and every one of our communities during the 90s into the 2000s. And so in order to do that, they had to establish operational control of our southern border. Now, on the south side, they do so through violence and through war. On our side, they do it through a gray zone conflict, meaning that they do everything they can outside of an armed conflict. So coercion, bribery, kidnapping, you name it. Everything is done on our side that doesn't elicit a reaction from the military. So once he established that control, they then have that pipeline. Well, now that is actually their greatest asset. That's their greatest commodity they can sell, is access to each and every one of us. So in order for China, Iran, and their proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, to get their people into our communities, they have to build relationships with the Mexican cartels, and that's what they've done. And so that's why it's so important. The executive orders that Trump did, really what he did is he made U.S. Northcom, he made Department of Defense finally do their job. U.S. Northcom was created in 2002 just like DHS, but they just sat in the back and did nothing. So now this is the first time under Pete Hegseth that they've actually forced them to make border security their top priority. And so by executive order and by command, Pete Hegseth and DOD has actually taken over from California to El Paso. They've now, the Department of Interior has ceded control of that area and has given it to the military. Unfortunately for those of us in Texas, Texas is about 95% private property.
Yeah.
And so because of that, the military cannot seize a control of the border, which makes it that much more vulnerable. The cartels have realized that. That's why it's actually getting more violent. In West Texas, they're now vying for control over oil. Oil, in fact, has now shot up in terms of return on investment for the cartels by 3 times. And so oil is a huge one. The narcotics also of crystal meth, and cocaine is also huge. Drones, and then also now the Gulf of America
and fentanyl, things like that.
Yeah, fentanyl. So because the executive order in Trump saying, hey, fentanyl's killing our kids. So really that's their main metric they look at. Well, because of that, the cartels are like, all right, we'll just shift our commodity or our product.
Yeah.
And so now they're just doing it through cocaine, crystal meth, and then they're going through just other means, whether that's through drones. They're still doing it through other areas here in Texas because, once again, we don't have eminent domain, and also the Gulf of America.
Yes. And just for a minute, since you were talking about that, you've got 2 problems in Texas. One, you got the private property. Second, you've just got this incredibly long border with Mexico. I mean, we have radio stations that are in, say, Rhode Island and Maine and places like that. They can't even get their head around how many miles there is to try to cover. And so when you don't have the military there, and you do, in some respects, hope for Border Patrol and anything that Texas National Guard can provide, this is, of course, sort of almost a whack-a-mole kind of problem. But it does seem to me that even with all of those challenges, we've seen the number of people that have been caught at the border going down substantially, haven't we?
Yeah, 100%. It's the biggest drop in recorded history. We haven't seen these numbers really since early when the Border Patrol really began, when they were doing the Chinese Exclusionary Act, right? When they were trying to stop, and that's why the Border Patrol was originally created in 1924, was for what they called the Chinese invasion back then, and then also for the Prohibition. And so they were actually created under the Department of Labor. And so now today we're seeing that numbers drop, and that's why you're seeing Border Patrol in the interior, because really that is the game now. We've been invaded, like I said, over 10 million people inside the United States. The majority of those, if they have not paid their debt to the cartels, are now indebted to the cartels. It is slavery. This is the largest American slave trade system that we've ever seen in our history. And that is to the cartels. And so when you look at that, now Border Patrol is now on the interior helping ICE, because ICE only has roughly around 6,000 officers across nationwide. That is not enough. So last year, there was a FOIA request to find out how many criminal illegal aliens are actually on ICE's non-detained docket. And at that time, there was already 650,000 that ICE knew of that were just not in detention. And so in order to get that many people, you're going to have to utilize agencies outside of ICE. And so the Border Patrol has been asked to help on the interior. And just like during Eisenhower's days, Eisenhower also asked at that time period for the Department of Defense to help, and they refused. And so what they did in the 50s is they brought in the Border Patrol, and they brought them to the interior. And so we're seeing that again. We're seeing any agency whatsoever trying to assist ICE conduct immigration enforcement to get the criminal illegal aliens out of this country.
Just before I let you go, first of all, we do have a link so that people can find out more about the Texas Public Policy Foundation, an organization I encourage you to find out about. We, of course, have your article that came out in May about the National Guard. But given the fact that we now have this domestic policy bill passed, who Donald Trump referred to it as a big, beautiful bill, we're now talking about billions of dollars to build a wall, to continue building it, I guess is a good way to say it, to also provide funding for more ICE agents, more Border Patrol agents. So in some respects, it does seem to me like help is on the way. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, 100%. Look, when Trump came into the office, the windows of opportunity opened up. And then when that big, beautiful bill was passed, all that did was open up the door. Now the hard work begins. We have to do all the hiring. We have to do all the budgets, the acquisitions, the procurement. Everything now, this is where we have to get on the ground, get our hands dirty, and actually do the work. We've now been given the money and funding to do so. It's now time to work.
Very good. Well, again, I commend our listeners to your article, which will get them into some of the things you've been writing. It will also, of course, link them to what is happening there at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And I couldn't think of a better person, having served both as a Border Patrol agent and also served as an Army veteran. First of all, thank you for your service, and thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for having me.
Again, you might want to find this article. It is something, we just now posted it. I guess we had one behind a paywall, but I think Karen's got it up there now, and it's about 3 pages. I've given you a brief summary, but if you said, okay, I'd really like to hear from somebody who didn't just visit the border, but somebody who was at the border. This is an individual that was there for 10 years. This is an individual that spent 20 years as an Army veteran and also in the National Guard, was one of the platoon leaders for Operation Lone Star. So if you say, okay, I'd like to get the best facts from people that actually saw it rather than secondhand through maybe the legacy media, this is why we wanted to cover some of this today here on Point of View. We come back, though, we've got an all-star game, and at least for some of us, we look at the fact that Georgia got snubbed the first time, and maybe this is a makeup call, but I think we can still talk a little bit about the problem with cancel culture. That will be kind of the theme as we come back. But first of all, we encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net, find those articles. We'll be back in a few minutes.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again, let's, if we can, focus on what's going to happen tonight in Georgia, and that is the All-Star Game. And whether you like baseball or not, the story is bigger than baseball. As a matter of fact, one of the writers for Wall Street Journal put it this way: baseball comes cap in hand to Atlanta because the All-Star Game was moved out of Atlanta in 2021 over the issue of voter integrity laws and was actually sent to Denver. And we'll be in Georgia again in September, but I thought I might just mention this time next week I'll be getting on a plane going to Alaska, and I thought I might just mention real quickly that we will be up there in the Fairbanks, North Pole, Alaska area. I'll be doing a live remote broadcast from KJNP. That will be on Thursday, July 24th. And so in some respects, you might want to be listening to that broadcast. But more importantly, for those of you in the area, I would encourage you to show up at the radio station because the staff at KJNP will be serving lunch to all of our guests. So if you'd like to watch the program live or even come in after the program and spend some time, we would encourage you to do so. And you might want to contact KJNP so they know you're coming and they can make plans. But we are excited to be up once again with our friends in Alaska. And, of course, I'm really looking forward to seeing our friends in Georgia. But let's set the scene. That is, Major League Baseball, as J.T. Young says, is trying to make amends to Atlanta with tonight's All-Star Game because, as I mentioned before, the game which was supposed to be played in Atlanta in 2021 was moved. And the reason it was moved is because in 2021, the legislature there in Georgia passed the Election Integrity Act. Now, these were just common sense packages and material. I did commentaries about it at the time. It expanded in-person early voting. It codified how you would use drop box in the future for absentee ballots. It shortened the absentee ballot request period from 6 months to 11 weeks. All you would think would be pretty good. It maintained the 29-day voter registration period before an election, which, as we've pointed out before, especially with some of the testimony even from Penna Dexter that was calling people at the time, was necessary. It even allowed people to bring food and water with them to the polling stations and a number of other things that were there. And it banned ballot harvesting. These were all common sense kinds of requirements and the kind of clarification that many other states had also taken advantage of. And there, as this article points out, were overwhelmingly supported. According to one that came out afterwards, a Gallup poll, this was a couple of years later, October 2024, more than 75%, more than 3/4 of Americans support early voting. More than 80% support requiring a voter ID and proof of citizenship. So that was not controversial, and it shouldn't have been at the time. But as J.T. Young points out, baseball, sensitive about its own history of racism, and also with maybe entirely too many woke people in some of these front offices, but he doesn't say that, but I do, moved the All-Star Game to Denver. And again, one of the statements from Major League Baseball was this: Major League Baseball fundamentally supports voting rights for all Americans and opposes restrictions to the ballot box. You might remember the time. Our listeners in Georgia probably remember that because, first of all, there were people who were not going to actually have their particular vendor at the ball game. There were people that were expecting that these hotels would be full of people coming in for the All-Star Game. You had the governor, Brian Kemp, talked about this being a classic example of cancel culture. We're going to talk about that in just a minute when we get into another one of these articles. And what happened at the time is the businesses that were counting on the game sued the league, and they lost. And so that maybe appeased the people on the left, but you can see really all of those criticisms came to naught. and forms were implemented. You had both in the 2022 and the 2024 election cycles. It turns out that they actually were helpful. Early voting in Georgia surged in 2022, and it hit a record high in 2024. And so, again, if this was supposedly some kind of thing that was going to hurt African Americans or people of color or people that were poor, it certainly wasn't doing a very good job of that. Of course, you know that it had nothing to do with that. And so eventually, of course, the reform uproar has subsided. Hard to believe it was 4 years ago, but here it is. And yet, let's just be honest, none of the politicians, as far as I can tell, nobody at Major League Baseball have ever apologized to the city of Atlanta or to the people of the Peach State. But nevertheless, in the spirit of tradition, Major League Baseball tried to figure out how to solve that. And for those of you that are aware of sometimes an umpire makes a mistake, well, heaven forbid, sometimes they have what's called a makeup call. And so I guess we could call this a makeup call. But I think at least a few of us should remember that not so long ago, just wanting to make sure that we would have integrity at the ballot box was too much for some of the people in Major League Baseball, and thus they decided to stick a finger in the eye of some of the people there in Atlanta. And I think that is a sad story about how cancel culture sometimes has gone the wrong direction. Which leads me to my next piece, and that is, I just love this. New York Times is even starting to say, maybe this whole cancel culture thing isn't working out so well. And the title of this headline is it time to stop snubbing your right-wing family? Now, this appears in the New York Times, okay? And it, I think, illustrates the point. David Litt is the one that wrote this article, and he says, not too long ago, I felt a civic duty to be rude to my wife's younger brother. I'll skip a few sections there. He says, I was one of President Barack Obama's speechwriters and had an Ivy League degree. So you can see he's already patting himself on the back. And my younger, if you will, I guess you call it younger brother-in-law, was actually a Joe Rogan fan and went on to get his electrician's degree. Okay, so, you can kind of see already kind of the elitist versus the plebeian mindset. So I appreciate his honesty. But he said we mostly just tried to get along, and we chatted amiably at holidays and family events. Now we get to the paragraph. Then the pandemic hit, and our preferences began to feel more like differences than differences in taste. We were on the opposite sides of a cultural civil war. And, of course, the deepest divide, well, you guessed it, vaccination. I wasn't shocked when Matt didn't get the COVID shot, but I was baffled. Turning down a vaccine during the pandemic seemed like a rejection of science and self-preservation. Well, he goes on and on. You know with the list. I won't even bore you with that. But nevertheless, James Freeman, writing about this, says, well, you now have David Litt going on to explain how despite his brother-in-law's continued non-compliance with Mr. Litt's opinions, the two now have found common interests that have nothing to do with ideology. And so he concludes his piece by advising some of the readers of the New York Times to be open-minded about friendships. But, let's face it, since he's a former Obama aide and he's writing in the New York Times, he can't quite make it to the end of a short essay on tolerance without trying to find somebody he wants to cancel. And that is, he says, okay, I'm working with my brother-in-law. We're working on different projects. But he then says that if Stephen Miller, he's, of course, in the Trump White House, wants a surf lesson, I'll decline. But are most people like that? In an age of banishment backfires, keeping the door open as likely friendship isn't a betrayal of principles, as affirmation of them. And so James Freeman said, look, your humble correspondent doesn't necessarily share Stephen Miller's immigration agenda either, but it just figures that at least at one point here, this guy, David Litt, just had to miss his own advice because he had to at least find somebody that I just couldn't be nice to. And the Times editors maybe, I think, illustrate what's going on in our culture. The fact that they felt that they had to write this article or have this article written or publish this article says a lot about the fact that they still hold a grudge. Just the fact that there is a piece that has, maybe it's time to stop snubbing your right-wing family, would be kind of what you would assume to be sort of common sense. And yet, nevertheless, there is a great illustration of how the cancel culture works still to this day. We come back from the break. I'm going to move from the New York Times to San Francisco and show how quickly public cancellations get out of hand. We'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, just for a few more minutes. Again, the article that appeared in the New York Times asking a very good question. Is it time to stop snubbing your right-wing family? And I agree. And let's give at least partial credit to David Litt, who actually tells his story about trying to make amends with his wife's younger brother, even though he went to an Ivy League school and his brother has an electrician's license. At least that was somewhat helpful. And yet I don't know that he completely followed his own advice. But lest you think that cancel culture is on the way out, let's, if we can, now go to San Francisco, because this is also part of the article we've posted. And that is, James Freeman said, meanwhile, on the left coast, the good people of San Francisco are currently running a test of whether arbitrary and capricious public cancellation should be culturally acceptable in the city by the bay. Wasn't this city once synonymous with tolerance? Well, having grown up there, yes, it was. We would accept just about anything, but now anything that looks like Trump, well, that gets you in trouble. Now, this is an article that appeared in SF Gate. And the writer, Susanna Guerra, said San Francisco's storied Swan Oyster Depot has been slammed with one-star reviews after a social media post publicized what appeared to be the support of the business for President Donald Trump. Now, the person that first posted this on TikTok said that she was walking around and saw a hat that was perched on a shelf inside this 113-year-old restaurant, and the hat featured the numbers 45 and 47. I don't think Trump's name's there. It didn't even have MAGA. I just think it was 45 and 47. I don't know. I haven't seen the picture, but that's what it sounds like. And instead posts on, of course, TikTok, am I late to the game, or did everyone else know this? And then the image was later shared on Reddit, where then, as you might imagine, it garnered hundreds and hundreds of negative comments and then eventually led to a slew of one-star reviews on Google and Yelp. Now, if you have ever worked in a restaurant or you've ever tried to even decide to go to a restaurant, you know that sometimes we look on Yelp or other places just to check and see, what's going on here. And I see a lot of one-star reviews. I'm going, well, they must have bad oysters there or something, because I wouldn't have expected that. And to his credit, the management actually responded. Kevin Senchimino, I think is how he pronounces his name, and he's one of the co-owners of the Swan Oyster Depot, just was trying to explain that they have a tradition there in the restaurant. And he says, and let me just quote him, Swan Oyster Depot routinely receives gifts from customers, and those gifts are often placed throughout the store. And the Trump hat was no exception, and it was added to the store shelf earlier that year. And so here's a good example. Okay, there's a hat on a shelf, 45, 47. Okay, that shouldn't have elicited that kind of response. Now, he goes on to even explain a little bit more, because in the article, it does at least talk about the fact that there's they don't post political banners or signs showing support from any political party. And it does embrace different political viewpoints. And that's one of the reasons why this co-owner, Kevin Senchimino, actually has, in addition to having on the shelf this hat, also has a whole stack of books, which include, for example, a copy of Hillary Rodham Clinton, Her Essential Wisdom. Never read the book, but I can imagine what you're getting there. And for the most part, he didn't necessarily see the Trump hat to be any more offensive or super offensive when compared maybe to politically charged MAGA hats. It just was a hat he put up there. And I love what James Friedman says. Mr. Senchimino actually understates his case, because for any reasonable visitor to the restaurant, a hat accurately noting that Trump is our 45th and 47th president ought to be less controversial than a book claiming that Hillary Clinton offers essential wisdom. But why not happily tolerate, as he calls it, Clinton puffery to enjoy a good meal with friends? Next to it, visitors from out of town might start claiming they're offended by the sight of the 49ers jersey on the walls. And again, I think it's interesting because this co-owner, if anything, probably should have written the piece in the New York Times, but nevertheless says, people can have different political views. We can all coexist in the same place. I just find it to be a little bit sad that someone would try to make a pariah out of someone or their business for having an alternative political view. It seems myopic. Why does political belief not fall under the realm of inclusivity? I think he's really asking some very good questions. And so as much as we are seeing cancel culture dying, and one example of that is maybe next time the Atlanta legislature does something that Major League Baseball doesn't like, maybe they won't feel quite as obligated to move a game, an all-star game, a World Series, whatever it might be. Just imagine if indeed the Braves had won their championship and were going to play in the World Series, what they would have done with that then. I mean, you just see that there is so much insanity, and as much as we'd like to believe most of us have moved beyond it, here is just a reminder that while there are many of us that just even can't imagine cancel culture, can't even imagine snubbing someone because we might disagree with them, you have the need, at least for one writer in the New York Times, to say, maybe it is time to stop snubbing your right-wing family. And then you have out in San Francisco, the city by the bay, a place where we oftentimes expect a fair amount of tolerance and inclusivity, all sorts of, and this is really sad for their business, a slew of one-star reviews for a restaurant that has been there 113 years, Swan Oyster Depot. Well, maybe next time we're out there. As a matter of fact, just recently, my producer, although he's in Colorado today, was out in San Francisco, but I don't think he had time to go by the Oyster Depot. But next time I'm out there, I might try to go by there, if nothing else to say. We talked about you on national radio and gave you some thumbs up, even if all the other people gave you a thumbs down. And it's just a good illustration of what we need to do to go out there and to be more gracious and to recognize that this cancel culture has still found some roots and soil, still growing up, needs to be chopped down. And so, again, I give you two examples of cancel culture. We come back from the break. I want to give you a couple of other ideas. That is, we're going to have Daniel Greenfield with us. He's written a couple of things, but we're going to focus first on the fact that you have an Obama judge that is absolutely convinced that it is her responsibility as one appointee by former President Barack Obama to declare all sorts of things that were just passed by the House and the Senate and signed by the president as unconstitutional. And so we, of course, are not surprised that these kinds of things happen. But once again, we'll be talking about this issue of nationwide injunctions. And even though the Supreme Court seems to be moving, I think, rather slowly, but certainly in the right direction of trying to prevent these from happening in the future, we still are face to face with that. So we'll talk about that with Daniel Greenfield. Then after we finish with him, I have some comments about the schools and the school system, as well as my commentary today. So just a lot of things to cover still. And if you would like to know about some of these articles, like to find some of the material, it's all available at the website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll cover all these issues right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's a really a blessing to me and to all of us.
Everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I do appreciate point of view and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about, of course, an issue that we have focused on, and that is this idea of nationwide injunctions. Recently, I did mention the fact that you had a testimony that was actually coming from Ted Cruz, because he was involved in really reminding us of the fact that in the first 150 years of the Republic, there was not a single nationwide injunction that was issued. Only 27 were issued in the 20th century, and really under Presidents Bush, Obama, and Biden, just 32. But, of course, things have changed dramatically. And so I want to spend a little bit of time of certainly talking with an individual that can help explain some of that. And we do have the article by Daniel Greenfield on our website. And he is an Israeli-born journalist and columnist with nearly 20 years of experience. He's an individual that is oftentimes collaborated with David Horowitz. I might even mention we've got a link also to the latest, Corrupt California, Political Criminals and Criminal Politicians. His first book, by the way, was Domestic Enemies, The Founding Fathers' Fight Against the Left. And, of course, the article we've posted here, Obama Judge Overrides Congress and the Big Beautiful Bill. So, Jeff, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Let's, if we can, talk about this whole issue. You start kind of putting your tongue in cheek by saying, you know, I guess I missed the part in the Constitution that allows federal judges to override the president, and now apparently congressional legislation because of their feelings. Tell us more, if you might.
Well, we have an absurd situation. You know, back in the day, at least when there was abortion, they would discover, these activist judges would discover something in the Constitution that supposedly allowed them to do it. And they would discover an emendation, they discover a parentheses, they discover something only they could see in the Constitution. And at least they were maintaining the fig leaf, the illusion that they were somehow basing this on any kind of law. What we've seen, particularly in this aggressive judicial coup, and it is a judicial coup against the President of the United States, is that they simply are inventing things out of whole cloth, or they are simply declaring that, you know, it's they don't believe it to be the case. You know, their feelings when it comes, for example, to using the Administrative Procedures Act. And this was an act, by the way, put into place under FDR specifically to limit the power of the growing bureaucracy. It was never meant to prevent the president from carrying out his express wishes, but they will turn to a filing from the ACLU on the APA, and the APA says something of if this particular measure appears as if it was not well considered, well, we're just going to set it aside. And you have numerous federal judges coming up and saying, well, this thing that President Trump is doing, we don't think that it has been sufficiently considered. It's reckless, and I'm just going to halt its implementation. And the Supreme Court comes out and says, well, you cannot actually do this nationwide. And they say, well, we're just going to do class action lawsuits. Then we're going to get a class of plaintiffs from across the country, and we're going to do this over again anyway, which means federal judges are coming out, federal district judges are coming out and saying, we have the power to block the President of the United States. And now they've escalated beyond that to saying we not only have the power to block the President, the Congress and the President can move through with a bill like the Big Beautiful Bill, and we're going to go ahead and block that anyway, and we're going to go ahead and ignore what the Supreme Court said, because somehow federal district judges, which are not even mentioned in the United States Constitution, are more powerful than all three branches of the government.
Well, and you've got some good ideas that we need to unpack. One of those, let's start with the last one you just mentioned, and that is the Constitution created the Supreme Court, but the rest of those courts were created by Congress. And certainly you would say that if indeed we have some of these radical judges that are convinced that they have the power in one particular federal jurisdiction to stop what happens across the nation, if the Supreme Court can't rein them in, isn't it at least possible that Congress could rein them in?
It's certainly true. The former Representative Louis Gohmert has made that case over and over again, and it is pretty clear that Congress has this power. The problem is that Congress doesn't use that power, or really any powers these days, and that is one reason why the legislative part of the government is very, very badly broken. But the idea that these courts have this now virtually unlimited power is simply because we've let them get away with it. We've had this mystique around the judiciary. And by the way, this is true to some degree of the Supreme Court anyway, which is the only court there in the Constitution. We've had this mystique surrounding the Supreme Court. You know, if you go back to Jefferson or Lincoln, the general consensus of past presidents before the 20th century was that the powers of the court were limited to deciding individual cases. Thus, Bob comes to the Supreme Court. He has a particular case. The Supreme Court rules in his favor. That is quite significant for Bob. It does not actually change the entire structure of jurisprudence in the United States of America. Thus, Roe v. Wade would have been very helpful for this particular plaintiff. It would not have led to a transformation in the state of abortion in the country as a whole.
Yes.
And that's something we've forgotten.
Well, and again, one of the titles of that hearing that I mentioned just a minute ago at Ted Cruz was the supposedly least dangerous branch. That goes back to, of course, those of us that have read the Federalist Papers, that we thought originally, at least the founders thought, that the Supreme Court and the courts would be the least dangerous branch, and yet they seem to be running the government today. Let's give credit where credit is due. Even though the Supreme Court has tried in a 6-3 decision, which was actually about birthright citizenship, at least it was making the case that these lower court judges supposedly don't have the right to block the president's policies. But your article takes on an individual who actually was not only trying to do what she could to eliminate some of the actions by the president in terms of these people that are here illegally, but actually, I guess, gets the award for the first person to actually then try to declare parts of the big, beautiful bill unconstitutional. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
She's not even doing that because, absurdly enough, we're in a situation where these people are not even hardly referencing the Constitution. What they're saying is simply, I don't like this particular measure. I don't like the effect. We have a judge now in this case saying that it's blocked for that, blocking funding to Planned Parenthood is itself blocked for a good cause. What that good cause is, who knows? It's whatever the judge thinks is a good cause, and the judge is not even bothering to state what the good cause is. And this is where we are. We have judicial tyrants who are not even bothering with the Constitution. They're simply expressing their own particular opinions, and we're pretty sure we know what those opinions are.
Well, let's see if we can take a break. And I want to get back and take a few of the comments because Ketanji Brown Jackson always seems to be interested in trying to express her opinions and her feelings. This particular judge, an Obama appointee as well. And if you would like to read this, it's written by Daniel Greenfield, and it'll gives you a little bit of an understanding of certainly the perspective there. We also, of course, have a link to some of the things that are available through their organization. We, of course, have his website there, so you can read quite a number of things that he has written about in terms of what has happened in the Middle East and the refugees and a variety of others, but also, of course, this issue of constitutional interpretation. So let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue looking at this issue of nationwide injunctions and the real need to find some ways to rein in these activist judges that are using power that was never granted to them, and seemingly every time they're being controlled or attempted to be controlled by the Supreme Court, just try to figure out another way to do what they're not supposed to be doing in the first place. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Ray Dalio is a billionaire hedge fund manager and founder of Bridgewater Associates. He was in Washington, D.C. to meet with senior leaders on the Republican side and the Democratic side about the budget deficit. He explained that virtually everyone agrees that you have to get the budget deficit down to 3% of GDP. He then asked them a logical question. Why can't you make a pledge that you will get it down to 3%? They explained the absolutist policies that must exist. You must make statements like, I will absolutely pledge not to raise your taxes, or I will absolutely pledge not to reduce your benefits. He concluded that this is the equivalent of an absolute pledge not to change the trajectory we're on in order to have a better set of circumstances than the likely financial crash that we're going to have. He lamented that they all agree about the consequences of this debt problem, and they all agree they cannot speak up because their constituents would throw them out of office. And their political parties will exert enough pressure on them that it is impossible to make those compromising statements and actions that bring together the revenue and expenses to produce a good budget. As I mentioned in a previous commentary, Lynn Alden, author of Broken Money, often uses the phrase, nothing stops this train, to illustrate the unstoppable momentum of fiscal deficits. She borrowed the phrase from a line in the program Breaking Bad. We have $37 trillion in national debt and nearly $2 trillion deficits each year. Members of Congress don't seem willing to stop the debt train. Ray Dalio's conversation with the political leadership illustrate they can't stop the debt train. That's why I've concluded nothing stops this train. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for a few more minutes Daniel Greenfield, again, a columnist, investigative journalist who's the Shillman Journalism Fellow at Front Page Magazine, Executive Vice President of the programs at the David Horowitz Freedom Center, author of a number of books and resources and investigative articles. We have a link to his website. Let me, especially for our California listeners, mention the piece that you can get digitally, Corrupt California, really incredible investigative piece, pamphlet, exposes some of the corruption there in California. Yes, you know some of it, but you would learn some other things by that as well. But let's, if we can, for just a few minutes, Daniel, at least focus on one individual that's in your article, and that's Judge Indira Talwani. First of all, she, I might just mention, is an Obama appointee, first declared that illegal aliens could remain here because, and I'm quoting her, it is not in the public interest to manufacture a circumstance in which hundreds of thousands of individuals will, over the course of several months, become unlawfully present in the country, unquote. So first of all, we just need to stop deportation. And this is one judge saying stop it all over the country. But then she just could not wait to outdo herself, because then actually granted on Monday the Planned Parenthood's request to temporarily halt some of the funding cuts from Medicaid. And that one goes back to even a Supreme Court decision. So tell us more about this individual, and what should we expect next from an individual that actually thinks she has the ability to stop everything from court-ruled decisions to congressional actions to executive orders by the President of the United States.
No,
cultural divide between earlier judges appointed by the Clinton administration, and some of the bad judges appointed by the Bush administration, and particularly judges appointed by Biden and some of the later judges appointed by Obama. And the latter judges are not just radical; they're not just bad, because that's generally true of the judges appointed from the left. They're incredibly ignorant. They're arrogant. We see this with Ketanji Brown Jackson on the Supreme Court. They're unable to often articulate basic legal reasoning. They simply just throw their weight around. And they think that their job is to be activists, but, not activists. The past activists would have found legal reasoning for going ahead and doing what they wanted. These judges just tend to simply assert that this is the right thing to do. This is what they want. They view themselves as just acting fundamentally as dictators. They have no limitations. They have no legal limitations. They have no limitations within the law. So actually, Justice Kagan, who is on the Supreme Court, she's an older school, older generation liberal, and she's obviously well on the left. But she reacted to federal judges simply ignoring the Supreme Court's decision with bafflement. She didn't understand how a federal judge would go ahead and simply ignore that the Supreme Court had stated that you cannot do this. And that really highlights the cultural gap here, because the newer generation of federal judges, particularly those appointed in the late Obama administration and by Biden, they simply will go ahead and do things without any recourse, without any legal rationale, because they simply are seizing power. And that is a very dangerous phenomenon.
One of the things that I find kind of interesting, and we see this at the Supreme Court, is I mentioned that case about birthright citizenship, which really was just more about the issue of injunctions. And in the midst of that, Amy Coney Barrett, who is not given to criticize other judges, goes out of her way to criticize Ketanji Brown Jackson by saying she decries an imperial executive while embracing an imperial judiciary. Then shortly thereafter, you have Sonia Sotomayor, who is a fellow liberal, criticizing Ketanji Brown Jackson, basically saying, you really don't even know what you're talking about because you're acting on a case that isn't even before us right now. And so that, I think, illustrates your point, at least with the Elena Kagan or Judge Breyer in the past, or individuals that might be liberal. At least you can sort of reason with them, even if they come to the wrong conclusion. This sort of new breed you're talking about, this is very different than anything we've ever seen before, isn't it?
Of constitutional government in real time. The barbarians are very literally at the gate. We have a new generation. This is not only judges, it's elected officials who don't recognize any limitations, constitutional or otherwise, on their powers. They have no idea how anything actually works. What they know is what the right politics are. Obviously abortion, drag queens, all that stuff. And they will assert that by any means necessary. They don't recognize the idea that there is any room for any kind of limitations, which means we are headed in for some very troubling times. And it's incumbent on us to obviously push back and do whatever we can, because with a point where you simply have a side that does not recognize any limitations on power, that side is in complete totalitarian tyrannical mode. It's there to eliminate any kind of checks and balances, any limitations in any of our rights.
Wow. Let me just mention, first of all, we have a link to danielgreenfield.org. And although I've seen your byline a number of places and read you before, I was unaware of your website. And of course, there's a lot of great material there about what's happening in the Middle East, Gaza, and all the rest. But I thought, since we're talking about the left for just a minute, one of your articles is a reminder that only 5% of New Yorkers voted for Zohran Mamdani. And I think this is a good example, Daniel. If a year ago somebody told me that it would be very possible that the next mayor of the largest city in America, New York City, would be a Muslim Marxist, I wouldn't have believed it. And yet we're just one election away from that possibility, aren't we?
We are indeed. This is a classic case of people not voting. And I know a lot of people are they have had it with politics. They think politics does not work. It does not change anything. And I can sympathize with that. I've been doing this for quite a while. But the reality is, when people just completely drop out of the system, and I say that coming out of both New York and California, those are places where a lot of people have just stopped participating in elections. When you don't, things get much worse. The people who, as bad as the people who used to run for office on the left were, when conservatives, good people, when independents completely just stop participating, it gets so much worse. And Mamdani is a classic example. As you mentioned, there was less than 30% turnout in the Democratic primary, which means most people did not even bother to show up. When the actual overall population of New York is something like between 5 and 7% actually voted for Mamdani. So most of the public is simply not bothering. And you can understand that because they have just this embarrassment of riches to choose from. They've got Eric Adams, a guy who's been sort of under indictment and is the current mayor, and people largely hate him because the city is a mess. And you've got Andrew Cuomo, who was ousted in a scandal and engaged in a pretty ruthless crackdown during COVID, lied about everything, abused people's civil rights. So, so many people are not at all incentivized to go out and vote for either of those candidates. And that's unfortunate because the result is, yes, you've got a Muslim communist who pretty openly supports terrorism on the verge of potentially becoming the mayor of New York City.
Wow. Let me just mention again that we have posted on our website, Obama Judge Overrides Congress and the Big Beautiful Bill, but we also have a link back, and let me encourage those of you to go to frontpagemag.com. First of all, you'll find other articles by Daniel, but also by Robert Spencer's been on the program, and David Horowitz, and a number of others been over the years, and you'll find a lot of great material that will be helpful to you as well. So again, just before we go, I thought I'd mention one last time, people wanted to get this digital piece because we do have quite a number of listeners, of course, all over the country, but especially California. You've, with investigative reporting, dug up all sorts of things in California, some of which people know about Governor Gavin Newsom and Mayor Karen Bass, but you're finding out all sorts of other things that people might want to know as well. So I might mention that as well. And so, Daniel, thank you for joining us. Thank you for writing your articles. And I would encourage people also to go and find you at your website, which we make available today on the website pointofview.net. So thank you for being with us.
It's always my pleasure. Thank you for this conversation. Again,
Daniel Greenfield, I've followed him before. This is the first time, though, I've actually taken the time to find his website. And once I found it, I found, well, he's got all sorts of articles we need to maybe post as well about what's going on in the Middle East and Gaza and a number of other things. But also that piece just struck me at a time when we've been talking about Zohran Mamdani. I'd heard that we had a very low turnout. But again, only 5% of the people in New York City basically elected him, or at least in terms of the primary. Now, he will, of course, have to run in the general election. We'll see what goes on there. But if you wanted to make a case for the fact that your vote counts, there it is. We've already talked about how it was primarily those with college degrees that voted for him. Those who did not have college degrees voted for Cuomo. And again, they're just one election away from having a Muslim, Marxist, socialist, communist as your mayor of New York City. The value of one vote. I think I've made my case. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kirby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
Back for the final half hour, but again, let me just commend to you, if you happen to be just joining us right now, that both Ammon Blair and then, of course, Daniel Greenfield both brought a lot to the conversation today, and certainly the conversation is helpful. Some of the articles with all the specific statements and quotes and statistics, even more helpful. So again, I would hope that you would want to go to the website pointofview.net, find some of the articles we've mentioned and put them to good use. You are certainly welcome to use those in any way possibly. You can post them on maybe X or Facebook, or print them out, hand them to people that you might know, and extend the reach of Point of View. So we certainly encourage you to do that. Let me, as a program note, mention that tomorrow we'll have Ryan Brown with us. He's the head of Open Doors. Talk a little bit more about persecuted Christians and some of the issues unfolding right before our very eyes around the world. Then Kyle Moran will be with us. He's written this very provocative piece, Tariffs Won't Make America Great. As you can gather, he is not a fan of the Trump tariffs, and I want to give you a chance, especially on some of these issues where there are different viewpoints, to hear his critical statements about the tariff issue and what the president has wanted to try to do, and certainly we wanted to give you that. Hans von Spakowski, normally we talk to him about election. I probably will at least ask him a question or two about that, since he's an expert on that and used to be with the Federal Elections Commission. But right now he's been speaking out on the decision that came down from the Supreme Court 8-1 about the right of the President of the United States to be able to hire and fire people in the executive branch. Who knew? I mean, doesn't it sort of make sense? By the way, 8-1, guess who the one is that didn't go along with that? Ketanji Brown Jackson. Are we seeing a trend here? This is the one where even Sonia Sotomayor, a fellow liberal, said, you really don't even know what you're talking about. You're trying to rule on a case that's not even before the court. But nevertheless, we are seeing some very interesting statements coming out there. So we'll get into some of those issues tomorrow on our Wednesday issue. But this last half hour, let's talk about what I call the 2 E's. First, economics, then after the break, education. Economics, well, you can see why I'm writing about that, because that is the piece that we have before us today by my commentary, which has the title, Nothing Stops This Train. Now, Ray Dalio is a billionaire hedge fund manager. He's also the founder of Bridgewater Associates. I might also mention he is the author of a book that I've been reading, which kind of gives us economic history, and I've been very impressed with him in that regard as well. Even though probably theologically and politically we may not agree, that's not the point. He really has an understanding of how do we get to where we are. Anyway, Ray Dalio, he's kind of an insider. He's a billionaire hedge fund manager, but he had been meeting with both leaders in the Republican Party and leaders in the Democratic Party about the budget deficit. And he says in this interview, and we've got information if you want to go and watch the interview, virtually everyone agrees that you have to get the budget deficit down to 3% of GDP. He's talking about just the deficit. The national debt is like 122% of the GDP, but we'll won't get into that. And so anyway, he asked a logical question of some of these political leaders. Why can't you make a pledge that you will get it down to 3%? And that's where he was confronted by what he called absolutist policies. And that is statements like, I will absolutely pledge not to raise your taxes, or I will absolutely pledge not to reduce your benefits. And he says, really, what I'm hearing both from Republican leaders and Democratic leaders is the equivalent of an absolutist pledge not to change the trajectory we're on, to have a better set of circumstances that will likely end up in a financial crash that we're going to have if we don't turn this around. And he said they all lamented and all agreed that the consequences of this debt problem are huge, but they all agree they cannot speak up because of their constituents, that's you, the voters, would throw them out of office And also their political party, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, would exert enough pressure on them that would make it impossible for them to even make even compromising statements, much less actions, to bring together the revenue and expenses to produce a good budget. Well, I entitled this commentary, Nothing Stops This Train. And as I mentioned in a previous commentary, if you go back to my May 14th commentary on Big Print, where I was talking about a very good book by Larry Lepard called The Big Print, we'll get into that in just a minute. He quotes Lynn Alden, who is the author of a book I'm reading now. By the way, I've read every word of every page on Big Print, and I'm trying to read, and I will probably by the time the end of the weekend's up, have read every word on every page of Lynn Alden's book, Broken Money, because I really think it's important for us to get to understand these issues. But anyway, Lynn Alden uses the phrase, nothing stops the train. Now, for any of you that ever watched the program Breaking Bad, you might remember the phrase. That's a point where he makes the statement that nothing stops this train. And that's the argument that a lot of people are starting to make. And Ray Dalio isn't making it, but eventually, if you think about it, that's what he's saying. We have $37 trillion in national debt. We have nearly $2 trillion deficits each year. A little less than $2 trillion, but you know, what's a $500 million amongst friends? You know, it's just amazing what we have. And we see that members of Congress don't seem willing to stop the train. And so that's why you hear this phrase all the time, nothing stops the train. A lot of that goes back to the book Big Print. Now, if that sounds familiar, you might remember the book or the movie The Big Short. And Larry Lepard is saying, you know, just as we had The Big Short in 2008, we are getting close to, as they like to say in the South, we're fixing to have the big print. And what he means by that is you can't keep this going. People are not buying our government treasuries. No country really wants to buy them anymore. We put some of these up for auction and you don't get purchasers. So ultimately, the Federal Reserve is going to have to buy them. Well, the Federal Reserve doesn't have the money. Where is it going to get it? Well, they're going to have to print the money. Now, again, I use print in quotes because they don't actually print it. They just put ones and zeros there. But you saw what happened the last time during the pandemic when we started printing money, when we increased the money supply. First of all, what happens is people with assets see those assets go up because it takes more dollars to buy them, but everybody else suffers. And it gets back to another commentary I have coming out in about a week on the housing crisis, in which, of course, if you watched Tucker Carlson the other day at the Turning Point USA, he talks about why is it nobody can buy a house anymore? And how did this happen? And he's identified the problem. I think we know what the solution is, and that is simply to recognize that you can't continue to print the money, but you can't stop printing the money because nobody wants to stop the train. And so as sad as it is to face the harsh reality of this, that's where we find ourselves. And there are ways to fix this problem, as I talk about in my May 14th commentary on Big Print, and as Larry Lepard talks about in his book, Big Print, and of course, as Lynn Alden talks about in her book, Broken Money. But the first step to this is you have to admit it's a problem, and nobody wants to admit it. How many times have you been in a town hall meeting and heard anybody talk about the fact that we have $37 trillion in national debt? How many times have you heard members of Congress talk about the fact that we've got to begin to turn this around so that middle-income people can buy an average home? You should live in a world in America in which people that have an average income should be able to buy an average home. And yet that is not happening. And there are solutions to this problem, but only if you admit it's a problem. And that, I think, is the issue. So, hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's the commentary for today. Nothing stops this train. there are solutions. One of those is political. It's about time for us in town hall meetings to say, what are you going to do about this? And a little bit of hand waving about trying to cut a little here and a little there. Yeah, we saw that under Elon Musk. How's that working out for you? We're supposedly have a rescission package that's going to pass the Senate, but even that, last time I looked, was $97 billion. We're talking about $37 trillion in national debt. Let's give credit where credit is due. They found some places to cut. And did you see the reaction even to some of these what might be considered minuscule cuts? And that's why you can see why more and more people are simply saying, nothing stops the train. Well, that's enough bad news. Let's, if we can, talk about what's going on in education. And Nicole Russell is actually talking about that in a very good article that appeared in USA Today. We'll talk about that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, going to talk about education, but since I digressed a minute ago to talk about Tucker Carlson, you might want to go and watch that video. He gave a speech at Turning Point USA and was really talking about, in one point, the idea of opening up the economic discussion and the fact that owning a home is really kind of the foundational principle of the American dream. And at one point, he talked about the fact that economics really matter, and they do, because, as he says, not because the rich are getting richer, well, they are, but everyone else is getting poorer. And he says, I'm a little tired of people telling us that the economy is doing great. We have a great GDP. I mean, that is true. But he says, I would propose a different measure. He says, my measure is really simple. I got a bunch of kids. Can they afford houses with full-time jobs at age 27? He says the answer is no way. And the answer is even for 35-year-olds with really good jobs, they can't afford a house unless they stretch and go deep into debt. And he makes the case that this is a disaster. This is an existential problem in America because if people don't own things, they don't feel ownership with the country. And I love one of his lines here. He says, when you have a lawn, trust me, you start thinking long term. Yeah, I mean, lawns or maybe trees in your backyard or whatever. And second of all, it's really hard to raise a family without a home. Yes, you can do it in an apartment, and many people do, but it isn't as easy. And of course, that just gets back to kind of what we call the American dream. And the younger you are, the less likely you are to believe that the American dream is for you. We can turn this around. We need to turn this around. There are reasons for why that has happened, not the least of which is we find ourselves in a debt-based fiat economy, which rewards people that have assets and punishes everyone else. So anyway, I just thought I'd mention that he's speaking to this issue, and I'm seeing people across the spectrum speaking to this issue. I've talked about some of these TED Talks, which are oftentimes given by individuals who would be very left of center, nevertheless identifying the same problem. So the good news is some people are talking about this. The bad news is not enough politicians and pundits are talking about it. And so I'll give credit to Tucker Carlson for bringing it up, especially as he's speaking to a younger audience. Now, some people say he might be running for political office. We'll see. But whether he is or not, what he had to say, I think, was right on target. Well, let's get into education, because that's another one of those issues. And this one by Nicole Russell appeared in USA Today. And she says, my kids attend public schools in Texas. I've had some tremendous teachers who I'm thankful for. Although we've had a good experience overall, it's clear that public education in the United States needs to improve. She gives us some of the facts we've used so often here on Point of View. K through 12 students in America lag peers in other industrialized countries in math and reading skills. Matter of fact, we've hit an all-time low. We spend more per student than almost any other country in the world, and we have less to show for it. And also, she says, while students struggle in core subjects, many parents say their children have been indoctrinated with liberal political bias. So it's not only that we aren't producing qualified students and graduates, it's that they're getting a heavy dose of left-wing politics. And she says, again, lest you doubt that, just go and look at the National Education Association's Teacher of the Year, Ashley Crossan, who delivered a speech which hailed education as a political endeavor. And she points out that this individual, who was Teacher of the Year, Crossan, is an English teacher in Mifflin County High School in Lewistown, Pennsylvania. And she said what teachers want is the same as what students need. And she said, what's good for educators is what's good for students. The best way to advocate for our students truly is to advocate for ourselves, the teachers. Now, again, the author of this, Nicole Russell, says it's okay, understandable that an NEA Teacher of the Year is pro-union, but the idea that the same things that are good for teachers and their unions are good for students is, he says, utter nonsense. Unions, for example, she points out, shield their members from the consequences of poor performance and even bad behavior. How does that help students? By the way, in each one of these statements she makes, there's an HTML link, I should say, so that you can see the, if you will, the evidence for what she's making the statement. But anyway, in the speaking that she did, the NEA Teacher of the Year, she said, once I realized how deeply political our profession had always been, I knew I could no longer sit on the sidelines. And again, should education be political and partisan? I think most Americans say no. Yet, according to, again, the research that Nicole Russell provides to us, According to Pew Research, more than half, nearly 60% of teachers identify with or lean towards the Democratic Party. And if you're not familiar, the National Education Association, the NEA's partisanship, has grown so extreme that even the union itself, and she's got a link to that as well, recently admitted that they had to maybe do a little better job representing some of its members who are members of the Republican Party. Then she changes from the NEA to the AFT. What is that? Well, Randy Weingarten is the president of the American Federation for Teachers, and Randy Weingarten has even served as a member of the Democratic National Committee for more than 20 years before resigning in June. And so again, just remind yourself of the NEA and the AFT that actually were teachers' unions that were pushed in to keep the schools closed, quite frankly, most of us agree, longer than necessary. And then she then points to the devastating consequences this had on our children's education, gives you a link to that. And then 5 years later now, we still see that there is an achievement gap that has not been erased. I mean, this was not just chronic, but it's acute. And it isn't just incidental, it's long term. And so again, she stops short of making some statements, but she certainly ends by saying, if public schools really were meeting students' needs, then the widespread adoption of school choice measures would not have nearly as much momentum as it now enjoys. If you haven't been paying attention, she points out that Texas, for example, now has become the 16th state to actually adopt universal school choice, and again gives us a list: Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, and others, where you can apply for state assistance. And again, if we value our teachers, and we should, whether they work in public or private school, that's the case. But I think she ends by simply saying, look, the Teacher of the Year speech was more pro-union than it was pro-child, and it's a mindset shared by millions of educators who have contributed to the mediocre educational results that we have. Again, if we recognize that competition works in the public sector and the private sector, why can't it also work in education, in the educational sector? So again, schools are struggling, as she points out, because teachers and teachers' unions oftentimes don't put the kids first, and their ability to show any kind of improvement hasn't actually been seen so far. So again, that's one of those educational issues we'll continue to look at, and you can find that article either in USA Today, or of course we've listed it on the website at pointofview.net. If you'd like to find any of the articles we've mentioned today, some of the interviews we've done with Eamon Blair and Daniel Greenfield, all available at our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. And again, Karen, thank you for producing the program. We'll be back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up, but we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.